All right, so we're going to record this. So I'll do a countdown. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, and this is a podcast where we go deep behind the headlines to analyze the pressing geopolitical issues of the day. We have a unique recording today. We are recording this in front of a live audience at the Emerging Tech Symposium at the beautiful Johns Hopkins SAIS Bloomberg Center building here in Washington, D.C., right on Pennsylvania Avenue, with the Capitol behind us. And with me, I have a repeat guest and a good friend, Ben Buchanan, until very recently, the White House Special Advisor for AI, and now I'm proud to say the professor at the Alperovitch Institute here at SAIS. Ben, last time we recorded an episode of Geopolitics Decanted, we were actually in the White House, and it was a fascinating conversation about AI policy that you were helping shape in your former extremely influential job. Now that you're out of government and are less restricted in what you're able to discuss, I'm very excited to have you back on for what I expect to be a terrific conversation. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. My understanding is that the room we recorded in last time in the Eisenhower building, the Secretary of War suite, is now the Doge office. So times have changed.
Indeed it is. They have, but in some ways not. Disruption was the name of the game for you, and it is certainly in this administration as well. So first I have a confession to make to the audience. Ben and I have known each other a very long time, I think going back to the early 2010s, and have had many private chat about AI and where it's heading. And I have to admit that many of the conversations we had circa 2019 and early 2020, almost 6 years ago, and 3 years before the release of ChatGPT, you, Ben, predicted with incredible accuracy where this would all be headed and the transformative nature of this technology. And I was a skeptic pushing back. And at the time, you were writing your terrific book, New Fire, about this topic, which I highly recommend to everyone. But my question is, how did you foresee all of this? What trends were you looking at the time that made you realize that LLMs were going to be very different from the traditional machine learning methods we've seen before, and that this was going to be a step function in terms of real change that we would see touching on almost every area of society?
Yeah, the development of AI over the last 10 years or so certainly is remarkable, and there's a lot of different moments you could point to where you start to see this acceleration in capability. But I think the most significant one that certainly changed my view and made me think it was all going to happen faster than previously I had thought was the development of GPT-3 in May of 2020. And this was obviously a very busy time in America. This was right before the George Floyd murder and protest. This was right after the beginning of COVID. And OpenAI published GPT-3 not even with a blog post, just a technical paper. But what was in the technical paper was something remarkable, which is it showed that what we now call the scaling law, or the scaling law hypothesis, was continuing to hold. And roughly speaking, this was saying there is a ratio of more computing power, as we call it compute in the AI industry, and paired with the right amount of data, can predictably scale AI capabilities. And this was a really important moment because it showed that we had a clear and identifiable way to making AI systems much better. There would likely be additional accelerants on top of that, but it showed that there was probably not going to be a ceiling, at least for a long while, on how AI capabilities would scale, provided we also scaled the computing power. And I think the basis of a lot of what we did in government was identifying this technical trend at which computing power, not something like data, was the bottleneck, and recognizing what that meant both for the technology and for America's national security.
So how did you foresee specifically, and there's still tons of skeptics saying this, that LLMs just do nothing more than word prediction or pixel prediction in terms of graphics, sound prediction, and that the output is good almost by accident because all they're doing is trying to determine what is the probability that this word should be next in the sequence, and they don't really think for themselves. You kind of disagree with that, right?
At some level, I disagree with it, but I think more fundamentally, it almost doesn't matter. There's an old saying in AI, asking whether or not computers can think is like asking whether or not submarines can swim. So, okay, sure, it's an interesting philosophical question, and we've had thought experiments and philosophy ideas and debates around this back to the 1980s, the Chinese room experiment being a well-known one. But I think
Can you elaborate on that one?
it's probably more detail we need, but basically if you're locked in a room and you have only Chinese phrase books and you can look up any perfect answer to any question, you don't actually speak Chinese, but it appears to the outside world as if you do. And at some point it doesn't matter, or so one side of the argument goes. I think the crux at the most practical level for large language models is, let's just grant for the sake of argument that they don't understand the world, certainly not in the way that humans understand the world. They're still useful, and they're still, from a national security perspective, extraordinary capabilities and benefits and risks from the technology, which I think as policymakers we had to confront. Now there's a lot of interesting technical discussion you could have about, are they just predicting the next word, and is it different now when we have them trained to do much more reasoning than was the case in 2020 and the like. And I think that makes a technical conversation maybe not so black and white, but at a most practical level, they're good at things and we should recognize that.
But you've always been very bullish, and remain so, that this is not just a better search engine, a better answer system, that this can actually be used for new discoveries, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so remarkable about large language models is if there is structure in a domain, if there is structure in data, they will find the structure. And that includes in many cases where we struggle to find the structure. And this is another way of saying they can make discoveries. The canonical example of this is protein folding, which is one of the hardest scientific challenges. Just the articulation of the protein folding problem, basically how the amino acids in a protein come together very quickly to go from a sequence of amino acids to a very complex 3D shape. The very articulation of this problem won the Nobel Prize. And then for several decades, there was a competition to try to figure out, could we discover the structure of every single protein with computers? And the reason why we want to do it with computers is because doing it manually is a painstaking process. It would take years of advanced crystallography and the like, but doing it with computers could help us accelerate this. And traditional pharmaceutical companies struggled with this. But DeepMind, a leading AI company, managed to accomplish this with an AI system that found something fundamental about the ways in which amino acids, the structure of their interaction, and how they fold together, and then essentially taught the world that. And now we know the protein structure of every protein known to science, which is hundreds of millions, whereas up until 2018, before this discovery, I think we knew as a species the structure of 150,000. So there really is an extraordinary capacity to create new knowledge and discoveries with these systems, and in the case of protein folding, knowledge that is practical and useful in drug discovery and medicine.
So where are things headed? And in particular, I'll ask the question that's not being asked. Where do you see AI perhaps contributing the least? In which field do you think that perhaps it will not have a big impact? I know that in most fields you feel very passionately that it will be very transformative, but where do you think it will not be
anywhere you
effective?
have humans as a bottleneck and like last mile delivery as a bottleneck and human institutions as a bottleneck, the pace of change will be much slower, because even in those fields right now, we are not bottlenecked by the technology. So there are unfortunately many people each year in the world who die of totally preventable disease. And it's not because we've not invented the technology to cure that disease or prevent that disease. It's because we haven't found mechanisms to get that technology to them, and the distribution and the like is the problem. So we should not expect that AI will fix broken institutions, and we should not expect that AI will fix things like that. And I think also for big organizations, even in the United States, that have a lot of bureaucratic inertia, we should maybe be skeptical that they will adjust quickly to AI. And this, by the way, includes the federal government, where we spent a lot of time trying to get the federal government to move faster on adopting technology in a way that was responsible and appropriate. So the human factor will certainly slow down the adoption of AI and its impact, sometimes in ways that are appropriate and sometimes in ways that are lamentable.
But you're talking about adoption and implementation of the technology. Does that mean that you fundamentally believe that there's no area where it couldn't be extremely helpful?
I think if there is structure to be learned, the AI systems will find the structure. And I imagine that most fields, even fields like philosophy, have some kind of structure. Now, I think it probably will be less useful with ethical debates than it will be with pure math. But I do think that there is going to be a lot of value for people who use this technology in basically every single field. bearing in mind the limits that I mentioned about application of this technology sometimes being harder.
All right, so this wouldn't be a podcast without about AI without talking about the topic du jour that we've all been consumed by over the last couple of months, which is DeepSeek. And there's been a lot of misconceptions about what DeepSeek means to the industry, what the real breakthroughs, if any, are. What is your view, and were you surprised or not surprised by their progress?
All right, let's just level set the facts here for those who are maybe a little bit less obsessed with AI than we are. So DeepSeek is a very talented Chinese company. It's spun off of a Chinese hedge fund called High Flyer. In the White House, we started paying attention to them in November of 2023 when they put out a system called DeepSeek Code, which we thought was particularly interesting. We, and Teddy Collins, who I believe was a guest on this show as well, and I followed their work very carefully. Teddy was the director of the National Security Council in the White House. We read the papers over the summer. We knew they were very talented. We also knew they were compute constrained, and the CEO of DeepSeek said that in the summer of 24 in an interview in Chinese that we found, saying that DeepSeek's biggest problem was not talent, not money, but computing power, in large part because of the export controls that we put on chips going to China in the Biden administration. And in December of 2024, DeepSeek made what I think is a notable but not particularly extraordinary publication with the publication of DeepSeek version 3, which had some pretty neat algorithmic improvements and efficiency gains, which meant that they could use the computing power that they had more effectively. The world did not notice this. We noticed it in the White House. We thought it was interesting. The world did notice in January, just after the inauguration, when DeepSeek added a reasoning component on top of this, which got a lot more attention. That component, the reasoning component, not particularly noteworthy. It was kind of a matching what OpenAI had done. But it is true that there was an underlying algorithm that DeepSeek had that was more efficient than maybe people had expected. I don't think it was more efficient than what US companies had done, but it was notable because it was a Chinese company showing that they could compete with this. DeepSeek, in my mind, does not change anything fundamental about the United States approach to AI and to China, which is they're still incredibly compute constrained. This remains the United States' advantage in this technology. We know DeepSeek is smart, but we knew that before, and we should continue to double down on our advantage.
But you know, the narrative that we've seen in the press that I certainly believe is wrong and you believe is wrong is that DeepSeek has somehow figured out how to make this exponentially cheaper, that chips don't matter, even though their own paper talks about the use of NVIDIA H800 GPUs to train this. But people are sort of zooming in on the headline number of $6 million for the last training run. Can you explain that and why they did not spend just $6 million to train this model?
Yeah, DeepSeek has this notion in their paper that they spent only $6 million on the last training run. That may be the case. They're not counting all the money they spent on the research up until that point, which I would imagine was tens of millions. Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of Anthropic, wrote I thought, a very good post on this, where DeepSeek and export controls, where he said, yeah, this would have taken us about tens of millions of dollars to do, and that's basically pretty close to what DeepSeek probably spent. And Anthropic did it a year earlier or 6 months earlier. So if you look at the trend lines in AI, that it probably is pretty close to where a US company is, which again is notable. But the real question is not, did DeepSeek have a lot of smart people, which we know they did. The real question is, will DeepSeek be able to keep up with the pace of progress as computing needs grow in 25 and 26? And I don't think you need to take my word for it that computing power remains important. As I said, you can take the DeepSeek CEO's word for it, or you can take American CEO's word for it. And Sam Altman of OpenAI is out there saying publicly that GPU capacity, compute capacity, is the limiting factor for OpenAI, that even American companies are struggling to get enough chips to do this. And they're not spending billions of dollars on data centers for fun. They're not spending that money because they don't have smart people. They're spending that money because that's what it's going to take to propel AI progress forward.
So if DeepSeek is still behind us, that means that 3 American companies, ChatGPT, OpenAI with ChatGPT, Anthropic with Claude, and Google with Gemini, are basically in the lead, and significant lead in AI. Why do you think that is? Why is it 3 American companies? Why is it not Mistral? Why is it not DeepSeek? What is so special that this technology seems to have been conquered, at least for now, and do you think this will hold in the future by 3 American companies?
Well, there's some path dependence here where this is coming out in a lot of cases from Silicon Valley and from the internet age and so forth. So we do have an ecosystem that's very strong. But I think two big important factors are immigration, where if you walk around OpenAI or Anthropic or Google, a lot of the people who are making breakthrough discoveries in AI were not born in the United States. And it's this America superpower that we get to bring people from all over the world, including yourself, to come to the United States and make these contributions. Back when I was at Georgetown, we did a study and we looked at the top 100 AI scientists by citation rate. This was back when people published AI papers and didn't keep the secrets for their companies. And I think something like 72 of them were not born in the United States. So this is truly America's superpower, that we can take the talent from all over the world and they make their contributions here. And I hope we don't lose that superpower in the moment that we're in. And then the second thing is capital markets. And AI companies, this AI business is incredibly expensive. These companies all have to raise or have billions of dollars, sometimes tens of billions of dollars, to do their activity. And the American capital markets can sustain that can sustain it.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you think about it, when you think about ChatGPT and OpenAI, fund a lot with Microsoft funds, Google obviously funding it itself, and Anthropic has a variety of investors, but Amazon is a significant investor as well. And it does strike me that it's interesting that these models effectively evolve from companies that have enormous side businesses, as you might call them, that are generating billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in free cash flow every year that can afford to spend it on data centers, GPUs, and the like. And that dynamic doesn't exist, for example, in Europe, doesn't exist in lots of places, may exist in China, where you're starting to see this competition. But you do have one other region of the world where they're sitting on a lot of cash as well, which is the Middle East. Do you think that the Middle East will start catching up? They certainly have big ambitions in Saudi and UAE to build data centers, to partner with AI companies here to become a significant player in this field.
Yeah, the conviction of Middle East governments is certainly remarkable in AI, and the ambition is certainly remarkable in AI. Whether or not they can translate that to building their own frontier company or partnering with US companies to do it is a really important policy question. I think my view is we are now so far along in the technological development that it's unlikely they will get there without significant partnership with the United States. And I think one of the important policy questions, certainly for the Biden administration and now for the Trump administration, is going to be how do you structure this partnership in a way that keeps the Middle East countries in the United States orbit without ceding dependence to them or without letting them or anyone else leapfrog ahead. And I think there's really meaningful ways in which we can have this partnership while still assuring an important spot for the United States in the leadership of AI.
All right, so one other, and probably the most significant development in AI this year has gone relatively unnoticed by the broader public and the media. I know it was very much noticed by you because you were the godfather of it, and that's the AI diffusion rule that was put out in the last week of the Biden administration. A lot of opposition to it across companies like NVIDIA and some in Silicon Valley, venture capitalists that think that this will kneecap US progress in AI. Explain what the AI diffusion rule is, why you felt it was important to try to push that policy in the White House. This is one of those executive orders that has not been rescinded so far by the Trump administration. What's so important about this particular issue?
Well, this was obviously a team effort of a lot of people in the White House, including folks like Jake Sullivan and Tarun Chhabra and Teddy Collins. And I think the essence of the AI diffusion rule is saying the computing power is so fundamental to AI, and the United States and our allies and partners have such an extraordinary advantage in the design, the production, and the use of computing power that we should be careful where we send this. And we should be very deliberate about where the computing power goes to make sure that, A, it's not smuggled into China, which is a significant risk. As you noted, DeepSeek continues to use smuggled or in some cases legally purchased US chips for their training. and B, to make sure that the United States is well positioned as this technology gets much better to use it alongside our allies and partners. So the diffusion rule sets up a mechanism in which basically a large number of countries can get far more chips than they need to carry out their activities, but we have good control on the smuggling routes and the like, maybe better than we did before the diffusion rule.
And explain how it works.
So the diffusion rule lays out a three-tiered structure for different countries. Tier 1 is very easy. Tier 1 is our allies and partners. I think there's some legitimate debate about who's in Tier 1. One thing I've learned from that process is I would never want to be there when the principals committee plans a wedding party, because they can spend a lot of time figuring out who's going to sit at what table. That we mostly left to the State Department and those folks. But Tier 1 is a core group of allies and partners. Tier 3 is also...
And there was some controversy around Tier 1 because not even all European countries are in Tier 1.
This is absolutely the case of who's sitting at what table in the wedding, yep. And then Tier 3 is also very straightforward, which is it's the arms embargoed countries, and we're not going to sell them anything. And then everyone else
So that's China, North Korea, Russia, etc.
Belarus, yeah, those kind of countries. And then everyone else is in Tier 2. And then the rule sets out a series of caps and structures to diffuse computing, really, I think, in very significant amounts into Tier 1 and Tier 2, but not to Tier 3.
So I remember we had a conversation some years back. I think it was you and me, and apologies if I'm prescribing to you something that I thought may have been said by someone else, but I think you described this technology as an equivalent of a nuclear weapon being developed, not in the destructive potential necessarily, but in terms of transformative, right? We had the world before Trinity test in 1945 and the world after, and it was a very different world. And before EI and after EI, it is, I think, now becoming very clear will be a very, very different world. And I think you posed at the time sort of the hypothetical of what if we had been able to control that technology in the United States, prevent its proliferation anywhere else, and how the world would look differently. And if we can achieve that with AI to a greater extent than we're able to do with nuclear weapons, the advantages that it would give to the United States would be enormous. Am I remembering this correctly? Was that you or someone
I don't think
else?
it was me. My preferred analogy is always fire,
Okay.
as you say.
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
do think this is a debate, and I think you can decompose a debate basically of U.S. policy in AI into two questions. The first is, how do we make sure we are continuing to lead at the frontier in developing this technology, that it remains our companies, that those companies have a strong relationship with the government to apply the technology in a way that's responsible? That's question one. And then question two is, how can we make sure we diffuse this technology around the world such that those companies are the ones that lead economically, that people around the world are relying on US systems or Western systems as opposed to Chinese systems, especially in the developing world. And I think the diffusion rule and our policy in general is trying to answer both of these questions, and insofar as there is tension between these two questions, between making sure we're at the frontier, but also making sure we diffuse the technology to resolve that tension.
So provocative question. I think the answer is obvious maybe to you and me, but maybe not to many other people who are not as focused on the competition with China as we are. But why would it be bad if China is a leader in AI?
Well, if you buy that this technology has extraordinary, I think, realized potential and then continued potential for military and intelligence applications, for things like cyber operations, which are obviously near and dear to your heart, then it is probably bad from a national security perspective if you saw Chinese capabilities that far exceeded US ones. And it's worth noting this is true not just of the development capabilities, but also the application of capabilities. And one of the things that worried me quite a bit, and worried many of us in the government quite a bit, is that our companies are doing great, but if we don't apply in the government, it's not going to help us in a national security perspective. So I do think, again, if you buy the thesis that this technology is going to be fundamental to national security competition, then it follows pretty naturally that we wouldn't want the Chinese to be ahead.
So the other element of this policy debate, and I know you struggle with, is, okay, we're going to control compute from going to China through a variety of export controls, diffusion rules, et cetera. But what about open source or open weights, right? You have one of the big companies, Facebook, that is maybe not in the top tier, but maybe not far behind. In fact, just recently released the latest Llama version of their model, publishing the weights publicly, that I'm sure are being used by a variety of companies in China and elsewhere to try to stay and catch up. So that kind of is a backdoor to the whole export control regime on AI that has been created, and What do you think should be done about it? Is that a concern to you? How do you think about it?
So at the risk of being pedantic, I would not describe what Facebook does as open source.
Open weights. Right?
Yeah, open weights. And I think the distinction is important, which is open source software publishes the code and often the underlying data and a lot of pretty useful stuff for other folks to build on it. And like Facebook is just publishing the model weights at the end of the process, essentially a long list of numbers, and putting this halo of open source around it, which I think open source advocates, including myself, would say this is not open source. In general, I'm very supportive of open source. I think the signal encryption protocol is great. I am ready for the year of Linux on the desktop. This, I think, is a very important part of our computing stack, and we shouldn't diminish that. In AI, open weight models raise some important questions, which is if you are publishing the weights to a system, it is trivially easy for someone to remove any safeguards built into that system. So if you ask Anthropic's Claude, for example, can you please help me build a biological weapon, it will hopefully and typically refuse and say, no, I can't help you with that. That's dangerous. That refusal mechanism is quite easy to take out.
By the way, we've seen that with DeepSeek, where the original DeepSeek model refused to talk about Tiananmen Square, but that restriction was removed.
That's right. And DeepSeek didn't even try to with the bio stuff. They made sure it complied with Chinese censorship, which probably tells you something. So on the one hand, the downside of open weight systems is the safeguards can be trivially removed. It's easy to build on this, to fine-tune it in ways that are particularly dangerous. You could take an open weight model and fine-tune it on virology textbooks and potentially add capabilities to the underlying brain, if you'd like, of the system that they're damaging. On the plus side, I think this is good for innovation. And having the weights out there, it genuinely does build an ecosystem that can be more innovative. And if you look at what was built on Llama 2 and LoRa and some of this other stuff, there are impressive technical achievements that were built on the back of open weight systems.
Well, and it's not just technical achievements. I can tell you, as a founder of a company, in my prior life as an investor, that if you're paying sort of the tax to OpenAI, Anthropic, for API access versus being able to use an open source model in your product, from a business perspective, that's an enormous advantage. And you're seeing all kinds of applications being developed in image recognition and other things based on these open source models that probably wouldn't be developed because of the cost prohibitive nature of paying the big frontier companies.
Yeah, and open weight models give you more control and so forth. So we had a real policy debate on this. And in the president's executive order, which he signed in October 2023, the way we resolved this was saying we want to hear from everyone. And we wanted to get a wide range of views on this open weight question to figure out, is there something the US government should do here? And we did that. The process ended in July 24, and the conclusion was essentially, at least for now, we're going to leave it as it is and let the system continue to develop. But this is something that bears watching as AI systems to continue to get more powerful. So we did nothing in the Biden administration whatsoever to restrict open weight systems. I think in many respects we are very supportive of them. There definitely is a spot in the ecosystem for them. I think the Trump administration will have to figure out where do they want to land as these systems get more powerful. But we I think saw the nuance in the debate, and this was a case where we decided to wait and see how it played out.
Was part of your thinking in not restricting the open weight stuff also a realization that if you're right and that the cost of training these new models will grow at an exponential rate, it will not become tenable, even for a large company like Meta, to keep spending billions, tens of billions of dollars without a return on that investment that more commercial companies like Anthropic or OpenAI and Google could do.
I don't know how much that weighed in the analysis. I think the biggest factor in the analysis for us was we just didn't perceive the systems we were seeing as particularly dangerous in 2024. So if that was the case, then there was no reason to act. That said, I do think the dynamic you just identified is probably right, which is as the training costs increase for AI systems, we're talking maybe $1 billion for some systems in 25 or 26, then it does become more of a dicey financial proposition to do that training and essentially give it away. So a company like Meta, should they continue to want to do this, will need to figure out what the business model is. And I think Meta's argument is, well, we'll just sell ads. Like, it's good to have this out in the ecosystem, and we'll just sell ads alongside of it. I will leave it to the business people to figure out what's sustainable and for how long.
So if the goal is to prevent our adversaries like China from achieving leadership position in this field, obviously preventing them from getting compute is a key path for that. thinking about how open source may enable them to innovate is another path you want to be very thoughtful about. But the third area, and one that perhaps is getting the least amount of discussion, is the cyber area, which is that, if you have these three frontier companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, they're developing this. Someone can break into their networks and steal those weights. B, they have employees working for them that could be recruited by a foreign power and subvert it to steal that information, steal the code as well. How do you think about that threat? And obviously, back to the nuclear weapons analogy, that's how we lost, at least initially, the proliferation of nuclear weapons because of spies within the Manhattan Project. How do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, I think the disanalogy in some ways to nuclear weapons is particularly striking because the nuclear weapons project, for as compromised as it was by Klaus Fuchs and the others, Soviet spies, that was still a government effort, and that was done in tremendous secrecy, dispersed across the United States, funded by government under the banner of what at the time was government classification. AI is none of that, and in some sense, I think the core intellectual insight, the through line between all of our AI policy decisions was that you have this remarkable technology, this revolutionary technology that is not funded by the US government, unlike so much else of what came before: space, satellites, early days of computing, internet, radar, of course, nukes. And this shows up in a bunch of different areas, but probably nowhere does it show up more than this question of security, because it's not born in this security apparatus that's kind of endemic, for better or for worse, to the government. And we recognize this fairly explicitly in the president's National Security Memorandum on AI that he signed in 2024. And there's an articulation at the beginning of that, of what I just said about this is coming from the private sector. And there's a whole section that says one of the implications of this is security. And we need to make sure that there's appropriate government support to these companies to make sure that they are secure. And the companies are taking steps to make sure that they are secure. And I think there's a shared responsibility to do that. This is something I worry a lot about, and I think you mentioned threats of it. You go to the right house party in San Francisco, you can learn a lot about where AI is going. You're in the right polycule in San Francisco, you can learn a lot about where AI is going. So I do think this is a case that we should be very alert to this, and the Trump administration will have to decide what do they want to do on security that provides the protection that we need without slowing down the very rapid rates of development that are important.
So given that, if you look at the cyber field that both of us are very familiar with, over the last 20 years, everything under the sun has been stolen, certainly in the unclassified realm, some in the classified realm as well through cyber and other means. Is this hopeless at the end of the day? You spend so much of your time thinking about the first two paths, particularly the first one with regards to export controls and compute, and you have this back door that you could drive a truck through potentially that exists. So why aren't you throwing your hands up and just saying, this is going to get out, there's nothing we can do, let's just not tilt at windmills?
I don't know that throwing your hands up is ever a basis for great policy. So I think we have to try something here, right? We have to play the hand that we're dealt. That said, I do think there's some reasons for optimism. First of all, there is the computing bottleneck. So even if you had some of the insights from the companies, you still need to have the computing power as a bad actor to train it, and we're trying to choke that off. So the choke point remains. And then I do think there's ways in which the companies can improve their security. And I think there's been some really good work by Rand and others to say this is what it would look like to build out a security apparatus that befits more powerful AI systems that are coming. And where that ends, are we training these systems in SCIFs in 2027? I don't know. Are we training these signal group threads? I hope not. But I do think there's a conversation that needs to be forced here about the security environment in which we're going to train and develop these systems. And that goes for the weights, and it also crucially goes for the algorithmic insights that go into training the systems.
So there was so much done during your tenure in the White House on this issue. So many executive orders, regulatory actions, etc., that came out. But I'm sure you have a wish list of things you could have gotten through but didn't. What are some of the things that are on that list?
Well, there's only so much the bureaucracy will bear, and we tried to push the bureaucracy very, very hard, and cabinet leadership very, very hard. But I think the one that remains on my wish list is controlling the H20 chip. which is an inference chip. So step back here, we controlled a lot of the AI training chips, the H100 being the obvious example. But we saw in 2024 a shift where in addition to AI training, there was increasing value to AI inference. Basically, the AI systems could, when they were given a particular problem, which we call inference, they would think for longer and get better capabilities as a result. They would reason, if you'd like. And these chips are totally unconstrained, and they're optimized for this kind of inference, and companies like DeepSeek use them very well. And in the waning days of the Biden administration, this was one that didn't get over the line. But I think if it were up to me, which it no longer is, this is something that I think would be important to control. And we'll see how the Trump administration looks at it.
So let's talk about chips, because one of the arguments that the industry makes is that the Chinese are going to get there, right? And Huawei has built the Ascend chip for inference. Some argue that they'll build their versions of H100s that will be equivalent, and there won't be much that we can do to stop them. So all this effort of trying to prevent NVIDIA from exporting GPUs to China will be all for naught, and will only damage our own companies because they'll get less revenue, and we'll be able to innovate at a much smaller pace. What is your answer to that?
So let's take the chip side of the argument first, and then the chip production side. On the chip side, the argument goes, as you just said, which is, well, if we were limiting who American companies can sell chips to, we are limiting the revenue of U.S. companies. It makes it harder to do the R&D. And this was an argument that some made in 2022 when we put the first chip controls on China, which is basically saying to NVIDIA, you can't sell chips to 1.4 billion people, including some very wealthy companies. And the argument at the time was, well, NVIDIA is going to go bankrupt if they can't access the Chinese market. And NVIDIA's stock, at least prior to the tariffs, had 10x'd since 2022. So they've done just fine. And the reason why they've done just fine is there's an extraordinary demand for AI chips. And every single chip NVIDIA makes, they will sell because, as we talked about earlier in the conversation, companies like OpenAI are saying very publicly they are chip constrained. And they could run their business and grow their business faster if they had access to more chips. So I'm not worried that the chips are not going to get sold. And I think if you look at the Trump administration's rhetoric, it's totally possible they say, well, in America first world, we want the chips to go to U.S. companies, and that's the economic view we take. I'll let them decide where they want to land, but I think the bottom line here is the chips that are made are going to get sold, and the companies that make chips are doing very well. Then the question is, well, could the Chinese also make chips? And we took a series of actions alongside the chip controls to control advanced chip manufacturing equipment. And I know you know this very well, Dmitri, but advanced chip manufacturing is, without exaggeration, I think the most extraordinary thing we do as this is nanometer scale work. Some of this equipment, the extreme ultraviolet machines, is just extraordinary in its complexity. It's the chips are made in a vacuum that's 10,000 times more pure than the vacuum of space, because even an air molecule will absorb the laser beams. They create plasma that are 40 times hotter than the surface of the sun, and from this plasma emits an extreme ultraviolet radiation that 50,000 times per second goes in this perfect pattern at nanometer level scale, going through mirrors at 0.1 nanometer level precision. You could go on and on and on about the extraordinary capability of this chip manufacturing equipment. China cannot make this equipment right
also,
now.
that students here at SAIS can write their essays with
Sure,
ChatGPT.
yeah, exactly. Or ChatGPT can write the essays. There is extraordinary complexity to this equipment. And we took the step of cutting off a lot of this equipment, which, to be fair, the Trump administration began doing during their time. So this is a bipartisan area of consensus. And I think this has greatly slowed Chinese chip production. And it is really revealing that the best Chinese AI companies, like DeepSeek, are using smuggled U.S. chips or illegally purchased U.S. chips rather than domestically made Huawei chips, because our chips are much, much better. My understanding is that there is not a single cluster of Huawei chips for AI outside of China in the world. And Rand did an analysis that showed of the top, I think, 50 or so AI systems, all of them are trained on U.S. chips. The chokehold here that we have a group of democratic nations over the supply chain is extraordinary. The view is we should use it.
Okay, so perhaps wrapping up with one last question. What do you think will surprise everyone about AI, the developments in AI, in the next 5 years?
if you think about how long 5 years is in AI, recognize that 5 years ago, we're recording this in April of 2025. 5 years ago, what I just talked about at the outset of the seminal moment, the scaling law hypothesis proving to be real, had not yet happened. GPT-3 had not yet happened. So 5 years is an extraordinary time in AI. And I think we will see that within 5 years, we will answer one of the most fundamental questions, one way or the other, about AI, which is essentially how high is the ceiling of intelligence? And can AI get us there? And my view is that the ceiling of intelligence, the ceiling of what we can discover about the universe, what we can discover with this technology is quite high. But I think anyone who's honest should admit that they don't know. And we will, I think, know one way or the other within that period how far away the ceiling is from us. It is worth noting that it is an endemic and repeated mistake of humanity to say that we are at the ceiling of performance in a particular task. So, I know you play a lot of chess, Dmitri. You, of course, remember when Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue, the IBM machine, in 1998. And then from that point forward, machines were much better than humans were at chess. But by 2015 or 2016 or so, we said collectively, machines are playing pretty close to perfect chess. The leading algorithm at the time, called Stockfish, was extremely good, could beat any human, could beat any other machine. Said this is the ceiling of chess. And what DeepMind did that was so extraordinary with their AlphaZero system was not only were they better than any human at Go, or the Japanese version of chess called Shogi, they were also better than any human at chess, and they're also better than any machine at chess. And the DeepMind system could outperform the Stockfish system, and showed that actually there was a lot more headroom in chess. And I think this is a pattern we will see across the board in different tasks, where the ceiling is further away than we think, and AI can help get us there. And if we come back here in 5 years at SAIS and that has not happened, we will know definitively, I think we're quite close to it, that this current paradigm of AI is not going to get us there, that we need something totally different before we do.
Or perhaps the tariffs had some effect on
Or perhaps
progress.
the tariffs had some effect, yes. Perhaps the tariffs had some effect.
So related question, AGI, big debate about artificial general intelligence and what it means. How do you think about AGI, what this is for you, and how close we might be to it?
Yeah, the term is not one that I particularly like, but it's often defined as a system that could do any cognitive task as well as a human. This is both about the breadth, but also to some degree about the depth, right? Can do anything a human can do cognitively as well as a human, and that's a very wide remit. I think it is likely we will have a much more jagged frontier, that AI will be much, much better than humans in some areas, but there will still be some where...
It already is in many areas,
Exactly,
right? Like chess.
exactly. I think the jagged frontier will continue, and I think what matters most is when does it start doing things that are really important for geopolitics and national security, among them automating AI research, accelerating the whole thing forward, improving cyber operations, improving and changing how we think about biology and the like. So I think that is more instructive to look at than the AGI threshold, which is very fuzzy. That said, I think we should be honest that if you buy my worldview, it's probably more likely than not we'll see an AI system that reaches this level of capability within, let's say, the Trump administration or within the next 5 years. And I think there are profound implications of that possibility that we need to take very seriously. And that was, I think, the basis of a lot of the policy making that we made in the Biden administration.
And do you buy the theory that some of these frontier companies have, that to get there, they will have to use AI, right? That only AI can come up with a system that is good enough to meet some of those definitions?
I think it is likely that AI will soon accelerate AI progress. And that if you look at some of the key drivers to AI, one of the ones we talked about, of course, is computing power. I think you will see, and already have seen through some of the work from Google, AI accelerating chip design. So we are getting more powerful chips because of the way we use AI in designing chips. And then those more powerful chips will in turn accelerate AI progress because more powerful chips are fundamental to AI. I think you'll see the same thing on the algorithmic side. And a lot of the companies have said, we are writing huge amounts of the code in our companies, not with people, but with machines. I think Google said something like a quarter of their code at Google is already written by AI. My guess is that's actually out of date and it's higher now. But I do think you will see this recursion effect, sometimes called an intelligence explosion effect, in which AI accelerates AI. And that is one of the most significant milestones to look at, or to look for, I think, in 25 and 26.
All right, and really the last question, but
I could do this all day, Dmitri. This is fun stuff.
oh, I know, and we have done that all day on occasion, but the jobs question. What is going to be the impact of this on the economy? Obviously, yes, productivity growth and so forth, but lots of people are going to lose their jobs. Who do you think are those people, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, this is a profound question, and I don't know that there is an easy answer. I do think there is an underlying question about how fast the pace of change will be, right? We talked earlier about how technological change does not always lead to organizational change. So it wouldn't surprise me if some of the economic impacts lag some of these predictions because organizations take time to adjust. So you could have AI be really good in scientific questions and yet not disrupt the insurance market or particularly regulate industries like healthcare. So that is one, I think, important dynamic to consider here. But one of the things that is striking about this particular era of AI that we're entering into is the jobs that will be changed and maybe affected are jobs that are more cognitively intense. And I think there was a time when we'd say, oh, automation is coming for blue-collar work. And I think this is the case where, no, we're asking it will do something fundamentally different to many white-collar industries in ways that could be good for the economy as a whole, but could be bad for particular sectors or for particular people. And I think this is a profound political question. And if you were planning on running for president in 2028, which many people are, I'm sure these days, you need to have an answer to this.
I assume you're not.
I'm not planning on running for president, no. And coming from the national security side of the house, I do not claim to have any answers to vexing labor economic questions.
But some of this is already happening. I was talking to a member of a partner in a large law firm, and they were telling me that they're already using some of these AI applications to write briefs that a senior partner still reviews, but things that a paralegal or even a junior partner would do in the past is now being done by AI, which to me has really profound implications, not just for the jobs of those individual people, but the way you become a senior partner in a law firm is by first being a junior partner and starting on the low end of the ladder. And if you no longer can do that, if the junior jobs are going to be replaced by AI, how do we make sure that the top of the field can still be developed?
Yeah, I think this is the vital question. I think this is the vital question for a place like SAIS or any place that's in the education and development business of how do you develop talent in an era in which these machines are out there. And again, I don't think this is a question national security policymakers have an answer to, but I think this is something that we should think very hard about. There are analogs to other fields and ways in which we teach math to people, even though everyone has a calculator now. And we still acknowledge that the teaching of math and development skills is important. I imagine you will see things like that. I think one of the upsides to AI is it will increase the amount of agency individual people have. You could do more with this. You and I have talked in the past about how AI helps develop songs for your family, and this is, I know people who, I'm not sure it's a good thing or a bad thing, use ChatGPT to generate bedtime stories for their kids. So there is a level of creativity here that I think is different. But I also think it will pose profound questions for institutions, law firms and universities amongst them.
And do you worry that it's dumbing us down in many ways, the way GPS has dumbed down location awareness for so many people? People can't follow directions anymore because they become so reliant on navigation from a computer that on so many tasks, we will just become so reliant on just asking AI that we will not be able to think critically and analyze problems well?
I mean, this is not an area of expertise, so take this with a grain of salt, but I think the intellectually honest answer here is yes, this is a risk. On the other hand, I am humbled in citing this risk because if you go far enough back, you can point to Socrates, who was saying, don't ever write anything down because it ruins the memory. And Socrates probably was right to some degree that our memories are less good than his because we write things down and so forth. So I think two things can be true, which is there can be this dynamic, and also the net benefits of the technology, just like the net benefits of writing, can probably still be good. And it's up to us as individuals and as a society to chart a course through that.
And we're here at SAIS, you're a professor at the Alperovitch Institute here at SAIS. What would you recommend to a student, maybe even an undergrad student or grad student that's thinking about studying various areas? How do they make sure that what they're studying is not going to become obsolete because of AI? What's the best way to keep at the frontier of whatever field you're in the age of AI?
The best way, I think, is to not study one thing, but to study an intersection of things. And these are the jobs that are harder to automate, and these are the jobs that, frankly, and I'm biased here, are the most interesting, right? We've talked here for almost an hour about technology and national security. And there's a richness that comes from the intersection of fields, being able to plant your foot firmly in the technology field and say, let's talk about chips, let's talk about lithography to make chips, but also let's talk about what this means for cyber operations and the national security side. It doesn't have to be those two fields, but I do think that the intersection of fields is where some of the most interesting and exciting challenges remain.
Ben, anytime I talk to you, I always learn a ton. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you for being a great friend.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.